Go west, young man. During the 1800s, many young men took Horace Greeley's advice to heart. For those who could not afford passage on a wagon train or other means of transportation, many saw a tour in the military as their ticket west.
I grew up...
Folks, today we're going to have an example of military life in the West. We're at the Fort Laramie Historic Site at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. And between 1849 and 1890, Fort Laramie was one of the most important military sites in the United States. And with us, we have Chief of Interpretation, Kay Thrillkill, to give us more information. Kay, it's very nice to have you on the program.
Well, we're glad to have you here today. I think it could be argued that we are standing, or sitting as the case may be, at one of the most important 19th century historic sites west of the Mississippi. From 1834, when the very first fur traders arrived at Fort Laramie, until the Army abandoned the post in 1890, this was really the hub of the Northern Plains. All of the overland immigrants came through Fort Laramie. It was very much a landmark, a third of the way through their journey. Most of the major military campaigns and the Sioux Indian Wars were mounted out of Fort Laramie, and most of the historic figures that you've heard of either were stationed here or passed through here on their way to somewhere else.
Today we have a genuine 1876 cavalryman reenactor and interpreter. His name is Casey Osbeck, and Casey, I'm going to ask you a few questions about the fort here. You are an expert on the cavalry as far as the people who inhabited this post, right?
Well, I wouldn't call me an expert, but I've studied it quite widely on the different cavalry companies that were here at Fort Laramie throughout its 40 years of being an active military reservation.
If you were the average cavalryman, how many months or years would you be stationed here?
The average enlistment here on the frontier for the cavalrymen and the infantrymen out here in the United States Army was 5 years. Now, if you deserted, it would be a different case. As far as staying here at Fort Laramie, it pretty much depended on your assignment here at this garrison, what your duties were going to be. Now, a lot of times these men, if they were going to do some campaigning, they would pass through here. This would be a staging area, and then they would go on. It depended on the Indian activity in the area, what kind of duties you would be doing. Company K, the 2nd United States Cavalry, which was stationed here during the summer of 1876, that was in this particular squad bay, was here for pretty much just the summer months. They had been at other forts throughout the other years. So it just depended a lot of times on what kind of assignment they were going to do at these military forts.
I notice you're not armed.
No, sir. And actually, most of the enlisted men that were here on garrison, like I'm off time duty, would not be armed. If you can see down here in those gun racks, they would be locked up when the soldiers were not using the carbines. Now, the pistols would be locked up with the first sergeant down in his room for the main reason that they did not want soldiers running around the garrison shooting each other. So they would be in the hands of the first sergeant, and he would have all access to them. Also, a lot of times soldiers would actually do a lot of stealing, and with single action Colt revolvers, they were pretty popular with actually disappearing and then being sold to civilians. There was a lot of civilians that were under the quartermaster department, such as doing sale work, other civilian quartermaster related work details. As far as the immigrants passing through here at Fort Laramie, they did have some problem with immigrants stealing horses and different other materials. But I think that really, from my reading, they did get along fairly well. But really, they weren't here for very long. About July 4th, they would be here, and then they would be passing on because they didn't want to get caught in the mountains with the winter months.
Casey, can you give us the average day in the life of a cavalryman here?
The average day in the life of a cavalryman here at Fort Laramie was pretty rigorous with fatigue details. Out here on the frontier, when these men enlisted, they soon found out that they were not going to be fighting Indians as much as they were going to be doing work details. After the Great War of the Rebellion or the Civil War, many fathers that had fought through there had sons, and they had told a lot of their war stories. So a lot of these young men, when they grew up, they said, yeah, I want to come out here to the frontier and fight Indians and be very glamorous. And they soon found out that this was different. They came out here, They were doing fatigue details such as the bakery for 10 days, baking 600, 700 loaves of bread a day. So they soon found out that their time was spent in here doing work rather than out being glamorous fighting Indians.
Kay, can you give us a little history about this building?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating building and a very unique one. It was built in 1874 as a two-company cavalry barracks. This squad bay that we're sitting in was occupied during the summer of 1876 by Company K of the 2nd Cavalry. The names that you see above the bunks are the men who actually were living here during that summer. About 50 or 60 men occupied this squad bay, and the only space that a man had was his bunk and the little shelf above his bunk where he could store his hat and some of his equipment, and then the footlockers like we're sitting on here. So you didn't have a lot of privacy and not much space for your things, but then soldiers only had a couple of changes of uniform, so you really didn't need a whole lot of space to put things in. It's a very unique building because there aren't very many large cavalry barracks that still remained. When the Army moved out of here in 1890, they held an auction and they sold off all the buildings here at the post. And most of the people who bought their buildings didn't buy them because they wanted to use the buildings for anything. They bought them because they wanted the lumber. And if you look around, you don't see too many trees around here. They had to go all the way to Laramie Peak in order to get lumber, and it was a problem not only for the military but also for the homesteaders in the area. So they came in and ripped off roofs and tore down doors and windows and carted away Fort Laramie and put it into homesteads all over this part of Wyoming. And the buildings that remained here at the fort were purchased and homesteaded by 3 different families. And the family who bought the cavalry barracks was Joe Wild's family. And he turned the cavalry barracks into a dance hall and a community center. It was a bar and really the hot spots for society in Fort Laramie during the 1930s. So the building did survive until the Park Service was able to take it over in the 1930s.
I see that this building is fully housed. There is not one open bunk, and every bunk has a name. Now, what were the peak years at the fort?
Well, we have chosen to do our living history program during the summer of 1876. That was the year when most of the Sioux Indian wars were going on up in Montana. General Crook was using Fort Laramie as a staging area, and so there were men through here like mad all that summer, troops coming and going. The Army was actually here at the fort from 1849 until 1890, and the number of men who were here varied significantly over time depending upon what was going on in the area, how many companies were here, who was passing through, etc. And varied from as few as 60 men up to as many as 700. But at the time that the post received word of the Custer massacre, I believe there were something like 19 men here at the post, and they were very concerned that if the Sioux came down into this area, that those 19 men might not be enough people to really be able to protect all the families and women and children that were still here.
Another important point that I would like to put across before we quit today is that this building is very unique because of the fact that this is one of the last of its kind, and we're very proud to have it here at Fort Laramie. And also the squad bay is very unique in itself too, because each individual bunk has history behind it. We've done massive research behind these bunks to determine the attitudes of these particular men. Each bunk has the bed's different, how this soldier would have probably acted. Many bunks, as you can see downrange here, are rolled up, and several of these men were on detached service at Chugwater Station, and a few were on other patrols. But there's also one interesting thing that I've always kind of laughed about is a few of these bunks are rolled up because that a few of these men are in Company Q or the guardhouse. One man named Henry Doyle is in the guardhouse at this time, and his bunk is rolled up. Now, many of the equipment you see on here would have been hanging like this. This was the individual soldier's house, and he hung all of his equipment above the bunks.
Obviously, Kay, by the equipment in this room, this must be the guardhouse. Can you give us a little history on it?
Well, you're right, this is the guardhouse. Many people think that the guardhouse was just for the prisoners, but that's not really true. The room that we're sitting in is the guard mount room. The guard was appointed for 24 hours, and they had to be on call during that entire length of time. So they would spend 2 hours out on the parade ground, walking around and making sure that the post was secure, and then they were allowed to come back and rest here in the guard room for the next 2 hours. But they couldn't undress. They had to wear their full dress uniforms, the big heavy coats with the gold epaulets on the shoulders, and there's those tall cavalry helmets with the gold plumes down the back, and of course their white gloves. And when you came back from your 2 hours out on the parade ground, all you could do would be to take off your helmet and your white gloves. You had to leave everything else on because you had to be ready at a moment's notice to grab your weapon and go out there on the parade ground if you were called for an emergency.
My word. And they guarded more than just the post, didn't they?
Well, they guarded this entire area. They guarded to make sure that there weren't any drunk soldiers, that there weren't any Indians coming into the post, that basically everything was secure and that all was well in the middle of the night. They also guarded the prisoners who were downstairs in the jail cells. Actually, it's more of a general confinement area, a large room where all the men would have been put in together. If you were especially bad, they'd put you into solitary confinement cells, which I'm sure we'll take a look at. But the guardhouse was not just for the prisoners, it was also for the guard.
When I was growing up,
This particular room we're in right now is the First Sergeant's room. This is where First Sergeant John Gleason had his own personal room. And he was the only enlisted man, aside from the cook that was detailed to be the cook, that had his own personal room. Now, he did conduct his personal paper business and company business over here to this room over here to the east, called the orderly room. The room we're in now is the day room. This was the recreation area if you're at Fort Laramie for Company K and any other cavalry companies that were in this building. Really, the Hollywood movies kind of portray the soldiers as being some kind of alcoholics, drinking a lot of beer. Really, some did, but a lot of them didn't. The percentage didn't because they weren't making enough money to actually do this. With $13 a month, if you owed the sutler any money, it would take quite a bit of your paycheck. Now, really, the bars here at Fort Laramie, as far as the enlisted men are concerned, didn't really get here until about 1883. So really, the officers out here on the frontier, since they were making a lot more money, and they did have the access to the liquor, were the alcoholics out here on the frontier. These soldiers would a lot of times come here because if they weren't paying customers here at the Sutler's Bar in the later years, such as 1883, they would have to come back to this room. Now, this was very popular with different books, as you can see up here. Usually the company library didn't exceed about 40 or 50 books in that area. If you were an immigrant from another country and you didn't know how to read, usually there was someone in this company that could either teach you or read to you. Now, other games such as cribbage, cards, checkers, different newspapers that were quite old by the time they got out here to Fort Laramie, you could also refer to as reading material. A lot of the enlisted men, both cavalrymen and infantrymen, a lot of times back in the day rooms in the barracks, played a lot of checkers. This was a pretty popular game. Now, with the officers, they were playing chess, a little bit more complicated. But a lot of the enlisted men came back to the good old game of checkers and cribbage, a lot of cards also.
This is the mess hall where Company K took their meals. As you can see, the tables are covered with oilcloth, and the cups that are sitting on the tables are actual reproductions of some cups that we know Company K actually used. The K stands for their company, and the 2 means that they were members of the 2nd Cavalry.
The laundress would have been, there was one laundress for every 19.5 men, good Army numbers. And she was usually married to a senior non-commissioned officer. And we deduced that because the fact that you couldn't enter the Army if you were married, and you couldn't marry without the commanding officer's permission, and he usually granted permission based on how many laundresses you needed. And that would be about 3 per company. And it's just my bet that if there are 3 sergeants and 6 corporals in a company of 60 men, and they can have 3 laundresses, it's probably the sergeants that got married, because that would have been a privilege. A sergeant, probably on his 2nd enlistment, would make $20 a month, $3 extra for being 2nd enlistment. And the laundress is making $19.50. That's set by the Laramie Post Council, $1 per month per enlisted man, and that's withheld from his wages the same way as the Army does now. The The laundress probably never sees it in cash because she's got a tab. You know, she gets her rations from the quartermaster in the commissary, but she's probably got a tab over at the post-trader's store for extra goods, because she and her husband, we know from the 1880 census that laundress families averaged about 6 kids. And it would take more than just 2 rations a day in order to feed all those. Besides her rations, she automatically was entitled to quarters. And of course the sergeant lived down here. His official quarters was in the barracks, but he would live here too. She was entitled to medical treatment, and that's something else that the officer's lady didn't have. The laundress often was the midwife who delivered the officer's lady's babies. She was one who didn't mind. That was probably the only contact that she had with officers' ladies. But often she was more trusted because the post surgeons oftentimes were out with the troops somewhere anyway on campaign. But even if they weren't, they were more adept at ichthyology and ornithology and keeping weather reports, and more adept at bullet wounds and arrow wounds than they were at delivering babies. So the women frequently would trust the midwives more. And it was, if there were problem pregnancy, it was a good bet that there would not be too safe a delivery out here anyway, whether it was doctor or not. One nice thing about the quarters, if the laundress became a widow from the campaign, she had job security. She was the laundress, she could stay in her tents and so forth. An officer's lady didn't have that kind of security. If she became a widow, the quarters was the entitlement of her husband, and she would have to leave usually within 24 hours, taking the remains of her husband back east, because as aristocratic families they usually wanted to have them buried in the east where the family was. But most of the people in the enlisted army were, about 90% of them were foreign born, and the same with the laundresses. Irish was about 50% of that, and this was a good way to come west. You wouldn't have enough money perhaps to be a member of a wagon train, but if you got out here with the Army, then after the 5-year enlistment, if you chose to, you could go ahead and take your discharge and set up homesteading, things of that type.
In the weeks to come, we will step back in time at Living History Farms, Des Moines, Iowa, and chat with the general storekeepers and the town doctor, and witness the evolution of farm life from pioneer times to the present. We will venture to the Old West, where the series will take you to abandoned gold mines and try our hand at panning for the elusive metal which drove so many to despair. We will visit the most significant military sites along the famous Oregon Trail for a glimpse of the everyday life of the people stationed there and the exploits of pioneers passing by on their way west. We will take you behind the bars of the frontier prisons to discover their role in the taming of the West and spend several enjoyable hours with our old friend Bill Cody for a personal glimpse of his world-famous grandfather, Colonel William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Other episodes include a look at frontier entertainment featuring a performance at the restored Atlas Theater in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a visit to the Wind River Reservation for a look at the blending of Native American culture and European religion at their Episcopal mission, and a talk with mountain men for an inside view of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and its influence on the exploration of the West. We thank you for allowing us to introduce our series, and we invite you to watch as we bring the living history of Americana on tour into the homes of America. Thanks for watching us, folks. The success of our program depends on you, the home viewer. If you have comments or questions about our program, please write me in care of Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729. We'll see you next week. That's Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729.
I'm an officer's daughter, and as an officer's daughter, we do lots of things here. We go calling and visit people, receive calls. Probably one of the most important things is what you do outside, or how you behave in front of people. as an officer's daughter, you have to watch what you say and do because your dad is usually an officer. And so you have to be careful that he doesn't gain a bad reputation or anything. One of the things that you do have to be careful out here with is your Victorian manners. You always wear the hat outside, you always wear the lace gloves, and you always wear your parasol. That keeps the sun off your face. It's very poor taste to have tan skin. It means you're of the working class. But as for life out here, it's okay. I usually come out in the summer. I go to boarding school back east. It's a much better school than here, taught by an enlisted man. I guess I could say it's okay out here. It's a lot of fun sometimes, but when the wind blows, and I've been out here for Christmas a couple times, and it just gets miserable cold, and the house is cold, the wood is wet, so things don't burn. But it's okay. It's a nice life, and I get to see my dad, of course. But other than that, the life of an officer's daughter is pretty simple.
Well, you've seen now the differences in lifestyles between the officers and the enlisted men's families. The enlisted men had to live in a barracks in one great big room, but officers' wives were treated like queens. Officially, they had no status with the Army. They were just considered to be camp followers, and yet unofficially, no lady ever was treated better than an officer's wife on a frontier military post. But there was very much of a very strict caste system. Officers' families did not associate with enlisted men. Enlisted men were not even allowed to speak to officers' wives. If they did, they would be severely punished. Officers' families didn't even come over to the side of the parade ground where the enlisted men were. They would always walk down by Officers' Row if they were traveling from one home to another.
Okay, it's been a real pleasure to have you as our tour guide here and interpret Fort Laramie. I appreciate very much the information that you have shared and your folks here with the American people on early Western military life. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have you today.
Although many military sites saw little action in the history of the West, their presence created a sense of security and peace in the minds of the settlers moving west.